In this video, we will show you how to replace your front lower control arm on this GMC Acadia. This is part of your front steering and suspension located behind your front wheel. Let's get into it. Okay friend, let's get started on our job. The first thing we have to do is safely raise and support the front of the vehicle so the wheel's off the ground. Continuing from there, we're going to remove all of our 22mm lug nuts and then the wheel. With the wheel out of the way, we have a clear view of our lower control arm. We're going to follow the lower control arm to where the ball joint is, down at the far end, close to the brakes. Looking just above this area, right below the axle, you're going to find an 18mm headed mounting nut that holds the ball joint stud in place. Typically, you can just use an 18mm wrench, start removing this mounting nut, and then we're going to separate this. Once it's broken free, we'll continue on. If you find when removing the lower ball joint mounting nut, the ball joint stud spins with it, carefully apply pressure underneath the control arm. That's going to put pressure on the ball joint stud into the steering knuckle. Since I'm replacing this, I'm not too worried about causing damage to the ball joint. Continue on trying to loosen this. If using the boxed end portion of the wrench, be extremely careful not to get it stuck in between the mounting nut and the axle. You may have to switch to the open end portion of your wrench to continue on from there. It's almost off of here. So that's up as high as it can go right there. As you can tell, I can't fully remove it due to the axle being there. At this point, we'll remove support from underneath the lower control arm. We're going to try separating the ball joint stud from the steering knuckle here. We'll apply some penetrant up along where the stud goes into the steering knuckle. Sit and let that do its job for a second here. Continuing on, you could use several different tools to attempt to separate the ball joint stud from the steering knuckle. There's going to be a ball joint stud puller that you can carefully get in this area and gently apply pressure. Other times, with the penetrant in place, you can usually either pull down on the control arm or carefully use a pry bar. Either way, you want to be extremely careful not to cause any damage to your aluminum steering knuckle. There we are. That broke free. With that broken free, we can take hold of this lower control arm and remove our mounting nut. If you find you have a hard time pulling this down by hand and being able to remove it from the steering knuckle, you can continue on with some leverage here. I just have a long pry bar. I'm going to come up above the control arm, but I do want to make sure that my brake flex hose is out of the way. So I'll just lift that up. I'm going to make my way into one of the grooves along the top of the control arm, making sure I'm as safe as possible. Now I can apply downward pressure. That's going to pull the ball joint stud out of here, and then we're going to make sure we give the knuckle a little tug, separating it and setting it aside. Now let's move from out here inboard. We're following the control arm to where it connects onto the subframe of your vehicle. In this area, you're going to find two 18mm headed bolts. We'll get both of these out of here and then continue on rearward. Along the back side of the control arm, holding this to the subframe, you're going to find that you have two 18mm headed mounting bolts that come through from the bottom all the way up along the top. On the top area here, you can see that we have two 18mm headed mounting nuts. We'll hold up along the top with a socket and a breaker bar. Along the bottom, I'll just continue on with removing the bolts. There's one of our bolts and the upper mounting hardware right there. Let's get this last one out of here. Keep in mind this is the last thing holding the control arm into the vehicle. We want to be extremely careful at all times. Get the upper hardware off of there. With all the mounting hardware out of place, we can continue on removing the control arm. To remove this, we're going to carefully start pulling it down, twisting it, and pulling it out of place. If you find you have a hard time pulling on it, gently pry. I'll make my way in between the subframe and the lower control arm along the backside, start sliding this bracket out of place. That should come right out of there. And there it is, friend. Before we continue on with any installation, we're going to make sure we clean and inspect our mounting points. Double check the steering knuckle to ensure it's not cracked or damaged in any way. We'll make our way over to the subframe. We're making sure nothing's rotted or damaged, weak in any way. Continue on rearward here. We've confirmed everything's clean. Let's start in the forward mounting bolt, just a couple threads here. Now it's time to install our brand new front lower control arm. When installing the lower control arm, we're going to slide the forward ear over the mounting bolt we just started in. Now we'll start focusing on the rear for a second here. We just want to pivot that close to being in place. While that's happening, we're also paying attention at the ball joint and the steering knuckle. We need to get these areas aligned and push the ball joint stud up and through the steering knuckle. Once you do have the ball joint stud making its way into the proper position, let's focus again on the rear mounting position. Back here, what we need to do is get everything properly aligned. As you can tell, with the suspension hanging, it's coming down at an angle. If you needed to, you could apply some upward pressure right along here. Otherwise, you can just use a pry bar, or we can even just use a rubber mallet, give it a couple taps, and it should want to position itself right into the proper positioning. Let's start in the rest of the mounting hardware. Do not tighten anything yet. Now we can move to the rearward hardware. We're going to be taking those two 18mm headed bolts and bringing them up and through this area, through the subframe, and up along the top we have the 18mm headed mounting nuts. You may find you have a hard time getting these areas properly aligned. If you do have a hard time, you could apply some upward pressure right along this area to pivot it as needed. Just put my jack right under here. Start getting this bolt through. See right there, kind of wants to stop. I'm just going to keep applying some pressure. See if it slides up and through. Now that that one slid up and through, I'm going to start on the mounting nut up on the top, and then we'll continue on doing the same exact thing to the rearward mounting bolt. Let's get this next one in there. Once again, raise or lower as needed. Remove your support. Let's start tightening all the mounting hardware. The hardware holding the control arm to the subframe will all be torqued to 74 foot-pounds and then an additional 90 degrees, which is essentially a quarter turn. So right there was my 74 foot-pounds. Now we need to go that additional quarter turn. There's our 74, additional quarter turn, here we go. As we make our way towards the rear here, we're holding those upper mounting nuts. Let's get that additional quarter turn for each of these as well. Moving along. To install your 18mm headed ball joint mounting nut, we're going to have to carefully pull down on that control arm again so we can slide it up and in between the stud and the axle, being extremely careful not to cause any damage to our axle. I'll just be using my pry bar once again, lifting up on that flex hose. We don't want to cause any damage. Be aware of any pinch points, of course. Continuing from here, to be able to tighten this, we're going to apply upward pressure right along the control arm. Directly under the bottom of the ball joint can cause damage to the ball joint, but then also in this area here, your jack could potentially slip. So try to be as close to the ball joint as possible, but not touching it, and definitely not on this slanted area. It's always a good idea to take your time on this. With the upward pressure on there, we'll continue on tightening our 18mm headed mounting nut for the ball joint. The torque for your ball joint is 30 foot-pounds, plus an additional 100 degrees. 30 foot-pounds isn't very much. Essentially, once you get that nut bottomed out, you just want to give it a light tap. As for the 100 degrees, it's a little bit more than a quarter turn. All right. Once you feel as though you're at approximately that 30 foot-pounds, we'll just continue on snugging this that quarter turn. Now that everything's fully tightened, we can remove support from underneath our lower control arm. One last quick inspection in this area, and we'll reinstall our wheel. Start on all 6 of your 22mm lug nuts. We'll bottom them out. Get the wheel safely back down on the ground, and we can torque each of these to 140 foot-pounds. With the wheel back on the ground, we'll be torquing these in a crisscross manner. Torqued. Okay, friend, we finished the installation of our lower control arm. Once you've completed torquing the wheel, the next thing you want to do is go ahead and take your vehicle for a road test. Listen for funny noises, get yourself safely down to your local alignment shop. Thanks for watching.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.